Good morning, everyone. My name is Mark Humphreys, and welcome to our webinar on mandatory vaccination policies and their implementation. I'm joined on the webinar by my colleagues, Philip Kruger, who's a director in the legal department, and my colleague, Alliance Ndlovu, who's an associate in our legal department. Thank you for joining us this morning to discuss the important topic of mandatory vaccination policies. During the national state of disaster, the Minister of Employment and Labour published consolidated direction on occupational health and safety measures in the workplace, which is more commonly known as the OHS direction, which entitled employers, subject to certain requirements, to implement vaccinations in their workplace. However, the national state of disaster came to an end on the 5th of May, 2022, and employers may no longer rely on that OHS direction to implement mandatory vaccination policies, as the OHS direction has ceased to be of any force and effect with the national state of disaster. Similarly, any regulations that were published in terms of the Disaster Management Act have also ceased to be of any force and effect. Now, based on that, Phil, what can employers rely on in order to implement mandatory vaccination policies?
Thanks, Mark. Mark, as you rightly say, there's been quite a sort of development in terms of the legislative process. So the primary basis upon which employers may implement vaccination requirements at the workplace is in terms of the Occupational Health and Safety Act 83 of 1993, which has really been enforced long since before the so-called OHS direction. So in terms of sections 8 and 9 of the Occupational Health and Safety Act, an employer has a legal duty to provide and maintain, as far as reasonably practicable, an environment that's safe and without risk to the health of its employees and others who may be directly affected by its activities. And important to note that it's not only the employer who has these duties. Also, in terms of section 14 of the Occupational Health and Safety Act, employees are under a legal duty to take reasonable care for the health and safety of themselves and others. So the measures that employers are required to take to comply with this duty are detailed in various regulations, and these are all published under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. And then particularly in the context of COVID-19, the applicable regulations that should be considered are the Hazardous Biological Agents Regulations, or the so-called Hba Regulations. Now, these regulations were recently amended, so near as 16 March 2022. And in terms of these regulations, employers are required to conduct a risk assessment to determine if any person could be exposed to a hazardous biological agent, and if so, they must then take reasonably practicable measures to control such an exposure in the workplace. If we then look particularly at Regulation 10, sub 4, sub G of the Hba regulations, it specifically provides that where reasonably practicable, such measures must include, amongst others, of course, the making available of effective vaccines for those employees who are not immune to the hazardous biological agent to which they are exposed. And then in this regard, it's also very important to note that the Hba regulations now confirm that the SARS-CoV-2 virus is classified as a Group 3 hazardous biological agent and specifies that a registered vaccine is available for use in South Africa. Now, in accordance with this, there also has to be a risk assessment that must be conducted by a so-called competent person. And we're of the view then that really a health and safety practitioner would most likely qualify as such a competent person. Now, in addition then to the Hba regulations, there's also the Code of Good Practice for managing exposure to SARS-CoV-2 in the workplace that is also now in force. And the code really echoes the provisions regarding vaccination policies that existed in terms of the OHS direction. In particular, the code provides that every employer must undertake a risk assessment to give effect to its obligations under the Occupational Health and Safety Act and the Hba Regulations. And it's then on the basis of the risk assessment that you develop a plan to include inter alia any measures to implement in respect of the vaccinations of your employees. And this may very well then also include the date by which employees must be fully vaccinated. Now, whilst the code does not constitute binding law, the code must be taken into account when applying or interpreting any employment law, and that includes the Occupational Health and Safety Act. If we think about an example, in terms of Section 8 of the Occupational Health and Safety Act, if you look at whether compliance there has been achieved to provide and maintain a safe working environment, surely inspectors and judges will take into account whether the employer has complied with the provisions contained in the code. In particular, then, the code would need to be read alongside the regulations for hazardous biological agents as issued in terms of the Occupational Health and Safety Act. And accordingly, in our view, it's really then the Occupational Health and Safety Act read with the Hba regulations and now supported by the code, which provides the primary legal basis for an employer to implement the vaccination requirements in the workplace. And this is really then deemed to be something that must be practicable as a control measure. And whether a vaccination requirement is in fact a reasonable, practically controllable measure will depend then on the particular circumstances based on that very important assessment of risk.
Thank you very much for that, Phil. And I think one of the key components of implementing a mandatory vaccination policy is this risk assessment that must be conducted by an employer prior to implementing a mandatory vaccination policy. Alliance, can you walk us through what are the requirements and what is needed in order to implement the mandatory vaccination policy?
Thank you, Mark. Well, as you have already dealt with the issue of the Occupational Health and Safety Act, and as well as Philip has touched base on the issue of the code, before an employer can actually implement a mandatory vaccination policy, as Mark, as Phil as well has also mentioned, you will have to conduct a risk assessment and an action plan, which will contain the exact measures that needs to be implemented for the purposes of the vaccination. And all of that, when I'm talking about the action plan will basically be based on the risk assessment. And in terms of the code that Phil has already alluded about, the employer is required, it's not a may, they must conduct a risk assessment, and they need to have the plan in place, which they will need to represent to the majority of the employees in the workplace, as well as the health and the safety representatives. And in terms of the Hba regulations, all employees must be informed of the risk assessment, and they must be given an opportunity to actually comment on the results that comes from that risk assessment. And before they can actually proceed to implement further, they will need to provide proof that they consulted with the employees insofar as the risk assessment is concerned, and as well as the plan is concerned. Furthermore, the employees, as I already mentioned, they will need to be informed of the result of the risk assessment and be given an opportunity to comment on those results. Under the circumstances, we all know in terms of the code and as well as the Hba regulations that the risk assessment is an absolute requirement before you can actually implement a mandatory vaccination. It's not by choice. It has to be done before an employer can proceed to implement a mandatory vaccination. In addition to this, the mandatory vaccination policy is not a one-size-fits-all. An employer will have to first consider the nature of their business before they can proceed to do the risk assessment policy. As a result, there is no general entitlement to implement a mandatory vaccination in the absence of the risk assessment, as well as the sufficient evidence and the reasons that are there to support for such mandatory vaccination to be implemented in the particular workplace. In addition to that, the code requires that the employer must provide employees with information relating to the nature of the vaccines, and if the employer is aware, based on the risk assessment that they would have done, about any adverse consequences that come from an employee having taken the vaccine. And in this regard, some employers, they would, in most instances, find themselves in a situation where they consider whether they're going to implement a mandatory vaccination policy, or they're going to consider implementing an admission policy.
Thank you very much for that, Alliance. And one of the things that have recently come out of litigation in the Labour Court is the concept of this admissions policy versus a mandatory vaccination policy. And in the Solidarity case, what the Labour Court held was that an admissions policy does not equate to a vaccination policy, and that has some effect on whether or not there's needs to be a complete compliance with the requirements of the code. And for example, in the case of an admissions policy, that merely restricts the access of employees and other persons to the workplace by requiring everyone who attends at the workplace to be vaccinated. That in itself does not constitute a mandatory vaccination policy, as our courts have held. And because of that, there is no requirement then to comply with the requirements to have a risk assessment conducted first before implementing the policy. And because of this, the implementation of admissions policies have become quite popular amongst, for example, some of our banks, who wish to cut down on the amount of admin that needs to be done prior to implementing mandatory vaccination policy. And as I said, that was then tested in the recent case by Solidarity, and the court held that a admissions policy is clearly distinguishable from a vaccination policy, which requires employees to be vaccinated, as opposed to an admissions policy, which merely restricts access to the employer's property. One of the other aspects that is being considered at the moment is around what's called the social contract. And Phil, what is the social contract, and how is it impacting businesses' decisions to implement this mandatory vaccination policy?
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, to me, really, the social contract is one of the main drivers when it comes to mandatory vaccination policies in the workplace. And it really is this theory that states that there's this implicit agreement amongst members of society and corporates that your social benefits could in some way, shape or form be limited for the greater good. So for instance, sacrificing an individual freedom for state protection. And really one of the reasons for advancing this argument is that it is believed that vaccination protects both the vaccinated individual and the society by reducing the transmission of the infectious disease like COVID-19. Whether that's based on medical science or not, that's neither here nor there. It's really the fact that this social construct exists in the psychology of society that makes it very, very important. So in order to eliminate the infectious disease, it is then argued that individuals need to consider social welfare beyond the mere self-interest, regardless of what their ethnic or religious or sort of national group borders might be. And therefore, it's really been reasoned that mandatory vaccination is required as a form of social construct, where individuals are morally obliged to get vaccinated in order to reduce the number of infections in the country as a whole. Now, emphasizing the social contract, in addition to sound medical reasons for vaccination, could really be promising interventions to increase vaccine uptake, prevent free riding, and eventually support the elimination of COVID-19. But it also spills further to that as well. It really impacts the commercial world that we trade in every day as employers and as business owners. If you think about a general due diligence that's being done on a specific company within a specific field, specifically then looking at public service entities where some service is rendered to the public, whether your staff is vaccinated or not could quite easily impact your goodwill, your income earning capacity, your contracts and contractual requirements when you are contracting with a potential customer or a potential client. Your skills retention and employment could be impacted by this. Do employees feel that you are doing enough to safeguard in the workplace? And of course, there's the tricky item of labor disputes. One of the items that you look at in a due diligence is what type of labor disputes the employer is currently embroiled in. So the question would become very relevant as to whether you implemented your mandatory vaccination policy in an appropriate manner, in a fair manner, and in a manner that complies with the necessary legislative requirements. And that, of course, will spill over into what type of labor disputes you might find yourself in. And then, of course, there's the general compliance requirements. Certain industries, particularly when there are large groups of people that are being serviced, have certain industry requirements that they need to comply with. And then, of course, the big one would be, what is your economic viability within certain sectors? We've certainly seen that with some of our clients that have requested the vaccination status of our employees that we would be sending to their premises before we would actually be allowed to go and provide the service to them. So it certainly impacts your capability of being able to run a successful business based on this social construct that you have a responsibility towards yourself, your employees, and your clients or customers to ensure that you are doing your utmost to look after their safety in these circumstances. And of course, if we look then at M&A activity, at mergers and acquisitions, if you are within a certain field, this could certainly impact what your fair value would be if you look at fair value determinations.
All right, thank you for that, Phil. And I think what we're seeing in terms of case law, and particularly when we're seeing dismissals, is that one of the clients' requirements, customers' requirements to be vaccinated give very good reasons for an employer to firstly implement a mandatory vaccination policy, and secondly, then to dismiss employees who cannot be reasonably accommodated. But that we'll deal with next week when we present our next webinar in the series, which deals with really how to enforce the mandatory vaccination policy. And just a reminder to our guests on the webinar that we are going to, obviously subject to time constraints, we are going to have a Q&A session at the end. So if you do have any questions, please post them on the chat, and we will do our best to get through as many of those questions as possible within our time constraints. Yes, back to the webinar. Well, Alliance, please, can you just walk us through some of the operational requirements? Phil has touched on them by talking about the social contract. Maybe just walk us through what some of these operational reasons that we are seeing for vaccines in the workplace.
Yes, thank you, Mark. As Phil already covered some of them when he was dealing with the social contract, most of them actually deal with the impacts that it will have on the business per se. As Phil has mentioned, the issue relating to the capability of a company being able to actually render its business to its full capabilities, it's one of the issues that actually come up under this topic. Because under the circumstances, you would have employees who would have the COVID-19 and they would affect other employees as well. And as a result of that, the workforce or the people that are required to actually perform work will find themselves being sick, and most of them will be taking a lot of sick leave. And also you will find that there are a lot of employees or some employees in the workplace that have certain comorbidities that they have, that if they contract these COVID-19, they will actually suffer major disabilities. As well as companies with workplaces that are identified as the cause of the community for the outbreak of COVID-19 might face a reputational risk depending on the nature of the business that they are in. If it's one of those clients where they actually require their customers or their clients to actually come to their offices, customers might be very wary of actually visiting those offices because they know that that particular company has an outbreak of COVID-19, and customers might find themselves going to other members or other companies that are in the same industry to try to get the same services. In addition to that, companies might find themselves, or employers might find themselves to be in breach of the Occupational Health and Safety Act, in particular Section 8, which requires that employees need to ensure that the working environment is safe for its employees. I understand under the circumstances that some employees might refuse to vaccinate on the basis of their constitutional right, and they might go and plead that they have a right to bodily integrity, and they then decide that they don't want to vaccinate. And when they do so, they'll be invoking the Constitution. But in most cases, employees forget that the rights that are there in our Constitution are not absolute. They're subject to limitations. And before they can invoke any right that's in the Constitution, which they will seek to rely on for purposes of refusing to vaccinate, they will need to provide a legitimate reason as to why they do not want to vaccinate. And for the court to actually uphold the reasoning that the employee might have in respect of the refusal, the court will consider all the relevant factors to determine whether to limit that particular right. And to the extent that the court find it justifiable for purposes of limiting that right, it might be the right to bodily integrity, the court will be entitled to limit that right, and the employee might not succeed in respect of the refusal. So the court will definitely have to consider not only that particular employee's rights, but also the rights of all the other employees in the workplace, as well as balancing the interests of the employer in trying to create a safe working environment in the workplace. And then I'll hand over to you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Alliance. Yeah, and I think just touching on what you've said is, I think that a lot of employees forget that it's one thing to rely on the rights, and you mentioned that they need to explain why they're relying on the rights, and that's exactly what we're seeing in the case law. Is that it's one thing to say I'm relying on the rights to bodily integrity, but a court is saying, but on what basis are you relying on that rights to bodily integrity? Why are you refusing the vaccine on the basis of this right? And from there, we've seen that those rights are limited, and it's been held as being justifiably limited given the purpose for which it is limited. And one of the other aspects that have come out of this is that a lot of employees, and we've seen it with some of the matters that have been referred to us, that employees are refusing to disclose their vaccination status, whether they are vaccinated or unvaccinated. And one of the reasons for that is they're relying on the provisions of the Protection of Personal Information Act, of POPIA. Phil, what are your views around POPIA, and how does it impact the mandatory vaccination process?
So Mark, you're quite right there. That's something that has come up a number of times when specifically engaging with employees regarding their vaccination status, but it comes up in general as well. It seems that POPIA has become one of those sort of rights that people like to fling into to stop a request to raise that as a defense. And certainly one has to admit that a consideration here is the Protection of Personal Information Act. The purpose of the Act is really to promote and protect the processing of personal information by public and private bodies. What is always important to remember, though, is that POPIA doesn't say that you are barred or prohibited from processing personal information. What it does say is if you are going to be processing personal information, you need to have a proper basis, a basis recognized in law for processing that personal information. And very importantly, it doesn't stop there. Once you've had that proper basis and you can gather and process the information, you need to be able to safeguard it. And you need to be able to ensure that that information will not be breached by any unauthorized individuals or the like. So very importantly, when we look at COVID-19 and your vaccination status, POPIA also introduced this concept of special personal information, which is defined then in POPIA as religious or philosophical beliefs, race, ethnic origin, trade union membership, political persuasion, health, very important here, or sex life, biometric information, and or the data of a subject when it relates to their criminal behavior. So until the code was published, it really seemed to a lot of employers that they are sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, you have the provisions of POPIA making it fairly difficult for you to try and process any form of personal information, or at least providing some requirements for you to be able to process that information. And on the other hand, there was this international trend that we were seeing all across Europe and all across America that said, unless you disclose your vaccination status by way of presenting your vaccination card or your digital card, certain social liberties are being withheld from you. And then there's, of course, the Occupational Health and Safety Act requirements that really tells you that you need to be providing a safe working environment for all of these employees. But now, once that we've gone through the primary basis for creating the mandatory vaccination policies, POPIA actually becomes quite clear in what it would require you to do, specifically then having a regard for the fact that this is special personal information. So special personal information can only be processed if that processing is carried out with the consent of the data subject. So whether it be the employee or a candidate for employment, whomever it might be. Or it can be that processing is necessary for the establishment or exercise of a defense or right or obligation in law. Processing is necessary to comply with an obligation in terms of international public law, or information has deliberately been made public by the data subject, and that we have indeed seen with many people publishing their vaccination achievement on their social media. And then there's also grounds to say that processing is necessary for historical, statistical, or research purposes. So in order for an employer to collect or disseminate the personal information regarding the employee's vaccination status, the employer would have to comply with these provisions of POPIA in respect of processing personal information. So notwithstanding that, the code does permit an employer, in giving effect to the code, to require employees to disclose their mandatory vaccination status and to produce a vaccine certificate. So this is welcome clarification in that employers don't have to grapple with this question anymore on whether processing employees' vaccination status is permissible. We do now have the code permitting that. However, I would advise clients that probably the best basis for processing of an employee's vaccination status would be if you could get their consent. I think consent in this regard, particularly because it is special personal information, would to me be the best ground that you could have for gathering, disseminating, and processing that information. So very important. I think consent is a great one to have. However, if you can't get the consent, it doesn't mean that you cannot process the information, and you could then, of course, rely on the provisions in the code.
Thank you very much for that, Phil, and very, very helpful. And I think that, one of the things was that until the code was published, because there was a lot of uncertainty around whether or not we were entitled to request, for example, the mandatory vaccination, the certificates of vaccination. And I'm glad that the code has now clarified that particular aspect. And I thank you to both my panelists. And I'd just like to say that, having regard to what we've discussed, it's quite clear that the mandatory vaccination policy is quite a divisive topic in South Africa. and where you have or are looking to implement vaccination policies, you should really seek expert advice to equip yourselves with the necessary information, advice, and supporting documentation to justify your actions. Now, I've had 2 questions that have come through on the Q&A panel, and I'm just going to, for the sake of, actually, at 3 now. Sorry, one has just come in, and I think the first question, Phil, I think you are going to be best placed to answer this particular question. It's from an anonymous attendee, and it says, if we interview a potential candidate for a position in our organization, are we allowed to inquire what is the candidate's vaccination status?
So my answer to that, Mark, would really be that yes, provided that you have the proper basis for processing that information. So you are allowed to ask the question, and you are allowed to process that information. Again, I would recommend that you should, as part of your questionnaire that you send out to potential candidates, you should have a consent clause there that you are allowed to process their personal information and to gather and extract this information during the process, and that you will deal with that information in accordance with the security provisions of POPIA. And again, as we said earlier, you can fall back on the fact that this is a requirement in your workplace if you do have a mandatory vaccination policy. And then you can fall back on the fact that the code would allow you to request that information.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Phil. The next question we've received states, my understanding of vaccines is that your recovery from the virus is better if the vaccine has been taken, but vaccinated and unvaccinated persons have an equal chance of catching or carrying the virus. So is it appropriate to enforce vaccination? And really, I'm not an expert in virology or anything to that effect, but from what the experts have told us, it's the basis of enforcing vaccination is not around whether or not it stops people from catching or at least being a carrier of the virus. What the medical experts are saying is it prevents the symptoms from being severe. And there is some medical evidence to also suggest that being vaccinated does reduce your risk somewhat from catching the virus if you're all properly vaccinated. But mostly where it is, it's around to prevent the onset of the severe symptoms of COVID, coupled with the reduction in recovery time, and obviously the consequence of reducing the more serious effects of the virus in itself then also helps curtail deaths. And we've seen that as we've become more and more vaccinated, and also I think it's a product of people having caught and assumed natural immunity as well. We've seen it as the waves have come and gone, that the death rates, particularly in the last cycle, have been considerably less now that more people are vaccinated. And it also has to do, I think, with the nature of the virus itself. But I think all things considered, I think that is the basis on which to approach the vaccination. But as we've said in our presentation as well, that mandatory vaccinations are not a one-size-fits-all. It's not something that you should do because you feel obliged to. It should be based on your operational requirements and based on sound reasons. And that may include, for example, you seeking advice from medical experts to say whether or not they suggest that the vaccination is taken in your workplace. The next question that we've received is can you implement a mandatory policy that focuses on certain individuals who might be identified as high through the risk assessment, or must it be for all employees? Phil, what are your views on that particular question?
So certainly the code does allow you to identify certain individuals who are at higher risk. Of course, in doing so, you do need to be careful because you don't want to be seen to be singling out certain individuals. You want to be seen to be acting in uniformity as an employer, just from a sort of a general labor law point of view. But certainly you can, the Act does speak about looking at high-risk individuals and determining for which individuals that should be a requirement in terms of their job spec. But again, I would advise caution in doing that.
Thank you, Phil. The next question is, where and how do we start the risk assessment? Alliance, do you want to answer this particular question?
Yes, no, I can gladly answer the question. So basically, the risk assessment needs to be conducted at the workplace. As I've already mentioned, and I think Phil also covered it, that it has to be done by a competent person. And the health and safety practitioner that is appointed at the workplace would be a competent person who can conduct that risk assessment, having regards to all medical and all relevant evidence that will be provided and all the information that they will obtain from the workplace. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks. Thank you, Alliance. And I think, also, I think what a lot of people are probably wondering in addition to that is, what sort of template or what sort of document must they use for the risk assessment? There are a number of templates that are floating around online. And I suppose the bottom line is that the risk assessment must be set up and it must meet the requirements of the code, but it must also set out your assessment of what your operational requirements are, coupled with the risks that are identified. The next question that we've received is, if a person is vaccinated, primarily because there is a mandatory vaccination or admissions policy in the workplace, and they are injured by the vaccine itself, would this then constitute a workplace injury and subject the company to liability? Paul, what are your thoughts on that?
Mark, I think it's a fairly interesting question, and it's one that I hope we will see some decisions on. Not that I'm hoping anyone will get injured by the vaccine, but there has been cases, and medical science has seen that there are, although there are exceptions to the rule, they're certainly not the general rule. There has been certain people who have had adverse effects to the vaccination. And yeah, it would be interesting to see how they would carry that out. Typically, when we're talking about workplace injuries, you'd have to be able to say, well, it was it occurred as part of your course and scope of employment, and it was directly related to that. So it would be interesting to see how courts would actually interpret mandatory vaccination policies. And whether the factual basis would support it. So would you be able to say that but for the mandatory vaccination policy, this individual would not have been vaccinated, for instance? And again, that would be interesting to see how the social construct and the social contract element of this is interpreted by the courts. So I think it may be a bit early to give a clear answer on this one, in my view at least. But it would be one that I think should be keenly watched.
Thank you, Phil. I think one of the other aspects, I suppose, to consider is the provisions of the Compensation for Occupational Injuries and Diseases Act, which, if it is pursuant to a workplace requirement, in all likelihood that would constitute a workplace injury, but COIDA would in essence step in to then indemnify the employer. But that in itself, as Phil says, would need to be tested in court, and we haven't had any of those at the moment. But it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But I think at this stage, based on the COIDA legislation, based on the fact that there's legislation which entitles you to implement a mandatory vaccination, the risk to an employer would be low. In addition to that, it would also be because of the way that our delictual law works. You would have to, for example, demonstrate a number of factors. We don't live in the States where we have big awards against employers for these types of things. Because of our delictual law, it would be difficult for an employee to prove, for example, that the employer had been negligent or even wrongful in applying the mandatory vaccination policy. So that probably would make a claim fail in those circumstances. But it'd be interesting to see how this plays out in our law. Another question is that many young people are not getting vaccinated. How will this pan out with enforced vaccination policies? Yes, it is something that we are seeing in the workplace, in a number of workplaces, that the young are feeling that they do not need to be vaccinated. And really what they're saying is that we're young, we're not at risk, and we're not getting vaccinated. And I think a lot of it has to do also with quite a lot of apathy, I think is the best way to describe it. Unfortunately, and there's a case, and we'll deal with it next week, where a young candidate attorney took that view and didn't want to get vaccinated, and the consequence was that he lost his job, and the court upheld his dismissal as being fair. So really, ultimately, what this is going to do is it's going to result in dismissals. And really, the courts are saying in these circumstances, if you fail to get vaccinated, it's really of your own cause why you've been disciplined and dismissed. And that's one of the things that employers are going to need to look at when they implement and enforce a mandatory vaccination policy, because it might have an impact on their workforce, particularly if they have a younger workforce. And that needs to be one of the things we need to look at, that if we've only got 50% of our workforce vaccinated, and the other 50% is strongly indicated that they refuse to get vaccinated, what impact is that going to have on our ability to meet client and customer demands? And are we prepared to lose half of our workforce? That's really the answer, the questions that you should be asking yourself. But at this stage, mandatory vaccinations are still quite at an early stage, and it will be interesting to see that if employers do enforce or make mandatory vaccination policies, that do they then make it that people end up getting vaccinated? Simple as that. I seem to be losing some questions. Next question is actually from a colleague of ours, who asks, how do you think hybrid working systems affect mandatory vaccination? And I think what we're referring to in terms of hybrid working systems is where you're working from home at some stage and coming into the office for another maybe say 2 or 3 times a week, particularly for team meetings and the like. Phil, what do you think? How do you think that would affect mandatory vaccination policies?
So, Mark, I think definitely it's an element that employers would have to take into account when it comes to the assessment plan. Is to what extent would your employees be at office and be exposed, or to what extent would they not be exposed? What I think is important to bear in mind is that, and that's really been one of the elements that's sort of been hotly debated with the sort of work from home atmosphere, is even though employees don't necessarily go to the office all the time, they are still socially active. They're still going to the shops, they're still going to the malls, they're still interacting with people. So they are still exposed. And even if it is then only a 2-3 day period at office, you then have to look at what that employee does. And I think that's the important part, is it shouldn't be necessarily based on where the employee is situated. What should matter is to what extent is that employee in a position of exposure when they are at the office? So in other words, is it an employee that, yes, might work from home most of the time, but when they are in office, they engage with clients, they interact with clients, they may have to go to clients' premises. So it's really all elements that need to be taken into account when assessing, do I need and can I justifiably implement this mandatory vaccine policy? So definitely it's a good question. It does impact it. You need to consider it, and I think you need to consider it very carefully.
Thank you, Phil. And we have time for one last question, I think, and then we at the limits of our scheduled webinar. And one of the questions that we've been asked is, I'm going to, I think, deal with this one. It says, can you please elaborate on informed consent when taking the vaccine? Now, one of the requirements, obviously, for any medical procedures that you have to provide informed consent, but the code does make it mandatory for the employer to provide information on the vaccine to its employees. So on that basis, the employee would have access to that information. And ultimately, the mandatory vaccination policy doesn't mean that the employer is holding you down and sticking the needle in your arm. What it is saying to you is that the information is available to you to have a look at, to make a decision. And then if you refuse to get vaccinated, that might have certain consequences if the employer is unable to reasonably accommodate you. And so basically, we've had some questions in the comments also around the enforcement of the vaccination policy, and we will deal with the enforcement of the vaccination policy, things like do we need booster shots and the like. We'll deal with that during our presentation in the next week, and we'll also do some case studies. We'll look at some of the latest case law that's come about with some of the facts and what the courts have decided around the vaccination policy. So please join us next week for our next webinar in the series. As I said, this will focus on the enforcement of a mandatory vaccination policy, and it's going to include issues such as reasonable accommodation of employees who refuse to be vaccinated, and the dismissal of employees who refuse to be vaccinated if it is impossible to reasonably accommodate such an employee. So thank you for your time and attention. I look forward to seeing all of you and hopefully a few more people during our presentation next week. Thank you very much.